holistic, one that accommodates the unavoidable realities of both the positive and the negative aspects of love. All right. Dr. Jenkins is here already. So Dr. Jenkins, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to share my screen. Let me know if you can see my slideshow.
Yes, a heart. Sad love.
We have the heart?
Right.
Okay, great.
Yes,
okay, so
the heart.
We are looking at there is the lovely cover of my forthcoming book, Sad Love. I did not design this cover, but I am absolutely thrilled with what the publisher came up with. So this book has taken me far too many years to write. I promised to deliver it to my editor 3 years before I actually did so, last week, basically. So what happened was I started writing it, and then during the pandemic, I actually had a really hard time writing anything at all, because trying to think about what kind of audience, what kind of future world I was writing into was really hard, and I struggled. So what happened in the meantime was, of course, my ideas about sad love and its connection to romance and to meaning sort of expanded, and they've exploded, I might even say, into something much bigger. So now the book is doing different kinds of work than what I had originally intended. We changed the subtitle to Romance and the Search for Meaning in order to reflect that. And I'm going to try to keep my summary of it, which is what basically this talk is going to be, as brief as possible. Please forgive me if I do ramble off on a few tangents, because this stuff is very fresh in my mind at the moment. I'll try to stop myself, and I'll say, raise this in the Q&A if anyone has more questions about this stuff. Am I right in thinking that I should talk for sort of 45 minutes-ish, and then about the same for the Q&A? Is that right?
Yes, Dr. Jenkins, you have 40 to 50 minutes to
Perfect.
talk.
Okay, great. So the project of the book is essentially, so I wrote a book on love called What Love Is and What It Could Be, that came out in 2017, and was really my attempt to kind of grapple with the metaphysics of romantic love, and ended up saying there's the two major components to what we call romantic love: the biological one, which consists in our physical, neurochemical, etc. responses when we go through the process of falling in love or being in love. And then there's a socially constructed element, which is about the kinds of romantic scripts and normative behaviors and expectations for romantic relationships that we give ourselves, that we live by. And I have been thinking more and more since I wrote that book about those scripts and those normative elements. And what I came to realize as I was writing this book was how prominent the role of happiness was in the romantic scripts for love. So really what I end up saying is romantic love is almost socioculturally, at least in the contexts that I'm familiar with, which are basically North America, Europe, Australia, and places heavily influenced by them. Romantic love has come to occupy this really special place in social and cultural life, where it's positioned at the center of ideals of a good life, more or less. And I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. I've come to think about romantic love. Some of this comes out of my earlier work, and some of it is newer. I've come to think about romantic love as something that's pretty passive, something you fall into. We think of it as static, so it's the kind of thing where you say you're fated to be with someone. It's supposed to last forever, and it's supposed to be fixed and not changing. You know, the fact that you are in love with someone is supposed to just stick around in the romantic conception. It centrally aims at this idea of the fairy tale happy ever after, which, although typically we know isn't realistic and nobody expects to be permanently blissful remains there as an ideal that we measure ourselves against. So we then consider ourselves to be failing insofar as we are not meeting that ideal. Romantic love is also, I'll explain more about this as I go along, inward looking, in the sense that it focuses on a particular dynamic between typically two, in fact, in the normative case, exactly two people, focusing on one another and their feelings about one another. And so it leads to this kind of monogamous, mostly heteronormative still, marriage nuclear family structure. Whereas in the new work, I'm interested in developing a concept of what I call eudaimonic love, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that in a bit. And the central aspects of this love are that it's active or agential. It's something that you choose and do, not something you accidentally fall into. It is dynamic in the sense that it is ongoing and changing, not necessarily fixed or fated or necessarily forever. It aims at not happiness, but meaningful, creative collaborations between people. And in that sense, it's not defined in terms of any specific emotions. And so this is quite a challenging part of the project, because we have come to think of love so strongly as a feeling, a positive emotion, something rather similar to happiness. And I want to make space for a kind of love that includes the full range of human experience and human emotions, including all of the positive and all of the negative emotions, and so can't be defined by any of those emotions because it includes them all. Eudaimonic love emphasizes interconnectedness rather than that inward-looking structure that I attributed to the romantic conception. And it can come in a wide range of configurations, including heteronormative marriage and nuclear family structures, but also all kinds of other family and other extended networks of care and community and concern. Okay, so where I try to start from in getting people to think about, well, really my agenda is getting people to shift over to thinking more like the eudaimonic conception of love. So I start from this three pieces of received wisdom in the scare quotes, but you know, the sort of thing that we hear a lot. First one says that a good life is one that is full of love and happiness. Bad life is one with neither of those things. Second piece of wisdom, received wisdom, love and happiness, i.e. the best things in life are free. You don't have to pay for them. Third piece of received wisdom, in order to live a good life, one should pursue love and happiness, as opposed to crass things like wealth, power, or fame. So this is different from the first piece of received wisdom in that it's advisory. So it's telling you what to do and not merely evaluating a life. And that is important for reasons I'll come to in just a minute. I'm not going to be talking too much today about the second piece there, number 2. I do in the full version of the book get into some of the intersections between romantic conceptions of love and individualistic capitalism, but those would be a detour for today, so I'm not going to talk about that very much. But what I wanted to emphasize here is that we've placed love and happiness in these kind of twin roles in defining the good life, the best things in life, what people should do in order to live a good life. And this goodness, by the way, I'm not particularly talking about ethical goodness. I'm talking about a good life in the sense of what you would, a well-intentioned parent or friend would wish for their child or their friend, or what you want other people to experience if you care for them. You want them to have a good life. The received wisdom is that kind of a good life looks like this. There's a fourth piece of received wisdom that is slightly different from these three, in that it doesn't have the same twinning of the two supposed positive emotions, but it's really important. And that piece of received wisdom says romantic love is the most important kind of love. And this is also one of the strands in, or the kind of thing that you can label as amatonormativity, which is a term coined by Elizabeth Brake. And it's the kind of thing that manifests in the assumption that one's romantic partner would, that relationship would take precedence over relationships with friends or family. For example, if you have to bring someone as a guest to a wedding, you would be expected to bring your romantic partner. It's expected that you will live with your romantic partner forever, but not with your friends. And in all of those ways, romantic love is kind of given a very central place in defining the structure of a good or normal life. Okay, so all of those are things that I present to you only really to kind of draw attention to them and begin to defamiliarize them a bit. I think all of them are very questionable and critiquable. Where I come from in my own sort of journey towards addressing them starts from considering sad love, and hence the title of the book. And sad love, as it's culturally represented in the kinds of cultural products that I'm most familiar with and that I was raised on, sad love, where you're not happy ever after and you are not happy at all, and you may never become happy. So maybe if you are experiencing long-term depression, as I was when I started writing this book, if you're in that position, you are sad. And sad love, as I read about it, was a tragic failure condition for life. So people who were sad about love were experiencing something that could be explosive and intense and overwhelming and deadly, right? You see this in pop culture. I've selected a couple of lyrics here, but the kind of things where people are saying very, very extreme things about being sad in love, like I can't live with or without you, and we only said goodbye with words, I died 100 times, you go back to her and I go back to black, 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 black. Amy Winehouse's take. But it's not just pop culture, it's also so-called high culture or high art, classic novels and literature and opera, and the plots of pretty much every great tragedy that doesn't feature a central male figure with an overwhelming flaw will feature a failed relationship and sad love and the tragic consequences of that. And so what we end up with is this conception of love where happy ever after love is the best possible thing in the world. Sad love is an absolute disaster. And we're not given much by way of actual tools for navigating reality, which is typically a mix of those things and everything in between them. So in order to kind of see whether there's a way to reintegrate the fullness, the richness of human experience into our conception of love as it exists between adults and between life partners, without just reinstating the romantic conception, I started trying to pick apart the romantic conception from a pretty philosophical perspective, not just a political one, which I also do. And I started thinking about what's known as the paradox of happiness, or it's sometimes called the paradox of hedonism. And I'll get to that via the United States Declaration of Independence, which says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, they are endowed with their creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so this is kind of a existentially defining statement for North American culture. The US conceives of itself as defined in these terms, like an origin story for that nation. And the idea that you are to pursue happiness is built right into that origin story. But if you look at someone like, many people have said this, by the way, Viktor Frankl is just one of them, but he has a statement of it that I particularly like. Viktor Frankl, for folks who don't know, he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and various other works. And he was a psychiatrist and a therapist who worked in, he was imprisoned in a Nazi death camp, and he worked to try to help the other prisoners survive effectively. And a lot of his therapeutic theoretical work after that was based on what he experienced there. Anyway, in 1946, in Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl says, to the European, it is a characteristic of the American culture that again and again one is commanded and ordered to be happy. But, and this is where he's talking about that idea of a pursuit of happiness. Happiness cannot be pursued. It must ensue. In other words, you can't chase happiness. It doesn't work that way. Happiness comes when you're pursuing something else. Here's another statement of basically the same thing from J.S. Mill in his autobiography. Those only are happy who have their minds fixed on some object other than their own happiness, on the happiness of others, on the improvement of mankind, or on some art or pursuit, followed not as a means, but as itself an ideal end. Aiming thus at something else, they find happiness by the way, or in other words, happiness ensues when it's not being pursued. Here's another version of it from Henry Sidgwick. Here comes into view what we might call the fundamental paradox of hedonism, similar, renamed it, but similar idea. The impulse towards pleasure, if too predominant, defeats its own aim. In more recent years, as you can see, these quotes so far are all at least 50, and in some cases many more years old, but more recent work, empirical psychologists have started to study this question of whether pursuing pleasure and going after happiness is successful, or whether it might be self-undermining. And some of the research looks like it could indeed be right, that it is self-undermining, as all these folks are saying. Here's one study from 2011, where the researchers found that valuing happiness was associated with lower hedonic balance, lower psychological well-being, less satisfaction with life, and higher levels of depression symptoms. So, this is not just armchair philosophers speculating. There is now some empirical support for the paradoxical nature of the pursuit of happiness as well. However, it being so kind of culturally ingrained in US, and I mean more generally, the sort of dominant culture that the US has exported to the rest of the world, has led to what I think is now becoming more widely appreciated as a kind of toxic positivity, which can manifest in various ways. But I in the book, I try to summarize a lot of them by talking about what I call the emotional dream. And I'm using that phrase there by analogy with the American dream. So, the idea that anyone can make it in America. You just go and you work hard, and then you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, start from nothing, and get your house and picket fence and perfect nuclear family, self-made man kind of American dream. So the emotional dream, as I see it, says the same thing on an emotional level, i.e. that anyone can succeed emotionally, which means be happy, if they pull themselves up by their emotional bootstraps. So do the work, stop complaining, meditate, be grateful, go to yoga class, whatever it is, eat better, and then you'll be happy. And if you're not doing all of those things, or if you're doing them and they're not working, you're failing, because you should be able to make yourself emotionally successful. So miserable people are failures, and it's their own fault. And this actually is also a point of view that has some historical precedence. It's not something that's emerged in the 21st or even the 20th, or maybe the early 20th century. William James, even way back in like 1902, I think this comes from the varieties of religious experience, starts to say things like that. Basically, positive people are healthy and negative people are sick. So he says a healthy-minded individual is one who has the tendency which looks on all things and sees that they are good, whereas those for whom the world looks remote, strange, sinister, and uncanny, or those for whom it's color is gone and its breath is cold are sick souls. So this kind of overlays a layer of health on top of the toxic positivity culture of the emotional dream, and I think that's very much still present. But the thing I'm really kind of calling attention to here is that the emotional dream, like the original capitalistic American dream, focuses on the individual to solve their own problems. And so it sidelines any kind of structural political factors. So any sort of oppression that the person is involved in, any kind of disadvantage that they're facing, any ways that the playing field is not level and the opportunities they have are not equal to the opportunities that other people have to be successful, whether that is financially or emotionally. Those are sidelined by this repeated idea that you can choose to be happy, you can just manifest that, you can do all of the things that you need to do your daily journaling or whatever, and just make yourself be happy. And in fact, that is, I think, quite a toxic and destructive attitude towards how human emotional life works, and indeed how structural and political factors contribute to human emotional life. Okay. Oh yes, this is a meme that I saw during the pandemic times that I think sort of sums up some of the American toxic positivity culture that I'm talking about, where you try again and again to explain that a structural issue needs to change, and all that happens is people try to give you back the responsibility for fixing yourself. Okay, so the kind of toxic positivity combined with this romantic script or norm for how to live a good life full of romantic love and happiness and be happy ever after, those things kind of constitute a conjunction of an offer and a threat. So it's saying, well, you want to be happy forever, don't you? Right? Well, then you better follow this life script. You better meet someone, settle down, have 2.4 perfect children and your little house with the white picket fence and the perfect stable career. Otherwise, you won't be living the best kind of life. With I mentioned already, the globalization of US culture, this is now everyone's problem. So the paradox of happiness is that pursuit of happiness doesn't work effectively. It makes you, if anything, it makes you miserable. And the heart of the emotional dream says, just pursue your own happiness and you'll figure it out. And that is, in fact, toxic and causes a great deal of suffering. And yet this ideology has been exported pretty much everywhere. Okay, so coming back to romance, what I try to do next is say that there is a parallel paradox for our romantic conception of love. So in effect, this just happens exactly like the original paradox of happiness. So the original says pursuit of happiness tends to make people unhappy. And this one says the pursuit of romantic happy ever afterness tends to be self-defeating, tends to make people less likely to achieve that. So one thing to say is that just because the original paradox is a paradox, it doesn't automatically follow that this would be a paradox, because sometimes, a special case doesn't always work the same way as the original case. So reading comments on the internet is generally a bad idea, but reading the comments on your friend's cute picture of their puppy is probably a good idea. So it's not guaranteed to work that way, but I think it does. And here are some of my reasons. So as I mentioned at the beginning, love and happiness, and this is now we're talking about romantic love under the romantic conception, those are positioned in these very similar ways in the received wisdom that we're being told to guide our lives by. And if anything, the fact that romantic love is positioned so centrally in our cultural understanding of how to be happy ever after only makes this worse. It just raises the stakes. And so does the ever after parts of the happy ever after, because that means basically you have no wiggle room. As soon as anything goes wrong, you are failing to be happy ever after. I'll come back to that again in a minute, actually. There's also, again, there's some empirical evidence that I think can help to support the claim that the romantic paradox is also a real one, a real phenomenon. So here's some from some studies from 2014, where they invited people to think about their relationship in different, what they call frames. So they gave them different kinds of prompts. Some people were prompted to think about their relationship as perfect unity, like pieces of a jigsaw fitting together. And other people were told to think about their relationship as a journey that they were undertaking together. And here's what the study found. People may evaluate their relationship more negatively after thinking about relational conflicts in the unity frame, because conflict signals disunity, than in the journey frame, where conflicts would just be part of progress. And what I think is going on there, although those researchers don't use this terminology, it's my terminology, but I think that what they're seeing is that the romantic conception, with its fixed idea of being fated for somebody being your soulmate, your perfect other half, that causes huge problems, because conflict is evidence that you are not with the right person. Whereas what they call the journey frame, I think, is much more aligned with what I'm calling eudaimonic love. It is dynamic, it changes over time, it grows. And on that conception, conflict can signal mutual growth rather than being evidence that you're doing love and therefore life wrong. Okay, so let's talk about eudaimonia for a second. So the first name that comes to everyone's mind in connection with eudaimonia is Aristotle's, but my conception of eudaimonia is not Aristotelian really at all. So I'll just kind of very briefly say why. So Aristotle, in Aristotle, eudaimonia would typically be translated as something like well-being or flourishing, or sometimes even just happiness, but it usually has a bit more to it than that. Aristotle thinks that eudaimonia is determined by your nature, i.e. your species. So for humans, for example, our eudaimonia consists in exercising our rationality well, and because of the nature of what kind of being a human is. For Aristotle, eudaimonia is closely tied to virtue. So if you are virtuous, you're eudaimonic, and vice versa. It's pretty much the case, according to Aristotle, that you can't be fully eudaimonic if you are ugly. You also have to be able to be a flourishing member of your species by being beautiful and attractive. And there are lots of things that I think are really suspicious about that conception of eudaimonia, so I don't use it. Instead, what I do is I look at the older meaning of eudaimonia. So before Aristotle was using it, it was already around as a phrase, as a word. And so I looked at its etymology, and it's built from the prefix eu, which means good, same as in euphoria, or and then daimon, which means spirit, or any kind of like supernatural entity, basically. So it could be like a god, or it could be just a kind of more low-key supernatural being, maybe a personal guardian spirit, that sort of thing. So eudaimonia kind of means good-spirited originally. And so when I'm thinking about this in contemporary terms, I'm not proposing to bring the Greek pantheon into philosophy, metaphysically speaking, but I am proposing to talk and think about metaphorical daimons, or spirits. For example, vibes, the vibe of a workplace, let's say, or the zeitgeist of the 1990s, or a genius locus, so the spirit of a place. So the way that it feels when you go to a country and visit there. Is it welcoming? Is the genius locus welcoming you or not? Those kinds of metaphorical spirits, metaphorical daimons, are what I'm talking about when I talk about eudaimonia. And also, those are all sort of larger scale, but there are also these sort of smaller scale inner daimons, which are kind of our own voices in our heads that tell us things like we're not good enough for that person, or queer love is wrong, or whatever it is that they're telling us. And they interact. the vibe of our time and place is going to inform what our inner daimons are going to tell us in some fairly obvious ways. We internalize those messages quite easily. Okay, so eudaimonia is about good-spiritedness. Eudaimonic love is ultimately going to be a kind of good-spirited love. But to get more sort of specific about what that means, I end up going back to Viktor Frankl, because he has a really useful thing to say about when we move away from putting happiness at the center of life and pursuing happiness, what we should put there instead of it. Because I mean, he's not suggesting we just ditch the pursuit of happiness and then all bets are off and nobody knows how to live. He's saying very specifically what makes the difference between life and death in a lot of cases, especially in the sort of extreme dire situations he was dealing with. What made the difference was not whether people were happy. Nobody was happy at his patients in the death camps, but some of them had meaning in their lives. And so he reports that those people were much more likely to survive. And he sometimes calls meaning logos or reason when he's talking about it in its therapeutic capacity to help people to make sense of their lives. And so when in Man's Search for Meaning, a big part of Frankl's project, which I think is extremely valuable and seriously underestimated and not nearly well enough taken up on a large scale, is that we need to put meaning into the central place that happiness currently occupies. So happiness, the way that it is currently conceived, is a hedonic state. So it feels good. It's individualistic. It's something that concentrates on one person, how they feel. Whereas eudaimonia, the kind of thing I'm trying to redefine love in terms of, is about good spirits in the sense of good people, obviously, but also healthy environments, positive influences, supportive communities and networks, those larger daimons that I was talking about. It's also about being a good daimon yourself for others. So in all of those ways, it's about interconnectedness. It's not individualistic. We find meaning in collaboration and creation. And meaning, I'm very much on Frankl's side here, is what makes life worth living, not happiness. So eudaimonic love is really a kind of love that is gonna take happiness out of the defining, the driver's seat, and replace it with meaning. And in so doing, it will emphasize all of these aspects of interconnectedness, because that is how meaning is understood and created. On the whole, I don't know any, maybe there are very rare individuals who don't require collaboration or contact with other humans to flourish and find meaning in their lives. But from everything that I have read and understood about human psychology, it is in fact a form of torture to isolate somebody fully, and eventually that person will be extremely unwell. And if you look at the effects of isolation in older people, for example, it is a killer. People die sooner and more often if they are isolated. So when I come to think about how to implement these ideas practically in a romantic context or a relationship context, I am inspired by, of all things, some research in management and organization and business studies. And I'll explain why. I know it sounds kind of weird, but this is how it turned out. So a couple of researchers called, excuse me if I can't pronounce this name right, I try, but I'm still struggling, Wisniewski and Dutton, they came up with and have been working subsequently with various collaborators on the idea of job crafting, which is essentially just the idea that when you have a job and you have a job description and your role is defined as you have to do this and that and the other within this institution or this organization, if you're a job crafter, you will tailor that job description to suit your needs and interests and what makes the work meaningful to you. And so here's an example of a person doing that. So this is Wisniewski speaking. She says, so one of their core cases was a crew of hospital cleaners. She said one of the members of the hospital cleaning crew that we talked with worked on a floor that cared for patients who were in comas. And in describing the tasks that were part of her job, she described taking down the pictures that were in the hospital patients' rooms on a regular basis and moving them around, switching them around between rooms. And when we asked her why it was that she did that, she said her thought was perhaps something about changing some aspect in the environment of the patients, although they were unconscious, might spark recovery in some way. So these are the cleaner, right? It's not what you might expect a cleaner's job to be, but so the researchers became very intrigued by this and asked, is that part of your job, given that you work on this kind of floor? And what she told us was, that's not part of my job, but it's part of me. So this is job crafting. It is making the work, it's agential, so it's exercising one's own agency and decision-making, taking action to make one's work more meaningful based on who one feels oneself to be, right? So what I do with that is I take that idea and I just transfer it over to love, and I talk about love crafting. And I think about the job description, as it were, for the role of a romantic partner that we're sort of handed as a one-size-fits-all. You're supposed to be monogamous, you're supposed to be in a marriage or marriage-like relationship, you should live together, you should probably have some biological children with the person, it should last forever, ideally. And at least until very recently in most parts of the world, and still in many, it should be with someone who is a gender opposite to yours. So that job description gets handed out to everybody by a society that thinks it's the boss of you, and is kind of right. It kind of is in some ways the boss of you. And when our identities or our preferences or our goals are misaligned with those expectations, that's when love crafting can happen. We can tailor the role of romantic partner to suit us and what makes loving relationships and ultimately life meaningful for us. So instead of trying to live the one fairy tale narrative over and over again, we go about co-creating our own narratives aligned with what we personally find meaningful. So eudaimonic love in this sense is all about doing something rather than feeling something. Okay. I just to emphasize, in case there's any misconceptions here, that doesn't mean you ignore your feelings. And if a partner is, making you miserable by being abusive, that doesn't mean that it's not relevant that you are sad in that way. But it means that the kinds of emotional state you're in does not define whether or not you're in love or whether your relationship is a successful one. The other thing about eudaimonic love is that it is always a work in progress and subject to change, which I know sounds very unromantic, at least to some people, because this is really the part where I'm saying that the happy ever after in the romantic conception is supposed to be the end of a story, the end of the fairy tale, whereas eudaimonic love, that is the whole story. You just keep telling stories, you keep having a life and growing and changing together, or maybe eventually apart, because it's about taking responsibility, not ceding it to fate, not saying, well, I was just destined to be with this person, so I'm with them now, so that's that. And even in cases where, actually, I'll come back to that thought in a second. So what we end up talking about, or what I think we might want to end up talking about, is the daimon, the spirit of a relationship, whether it is a good-spirited relationship, which is not the same as whether the people in it are good people. I'm sure folks are all familiar with that situation where you know two people who are both individually wonderful, but you put them together and it's a disaster. So a relationship can have a terrible spirit, terrible daimon, even if the two people, or however many people are in it, are great individually. But we're also thinking about how the daimon of a relationship is impacted by those larger scale environmental spirits or daimons. So if you live in a culture where queer love is prohibited or stigmatized, the daimon of a queer relationship, however good it might be in other contexts, is just not going to be able to thrive in the same way in that environment is toxic to that relationship daimon. And similarly, we're also thinking about how the daimon, the spirit of a relationship, contributes to the environmental spirit, the environmental daimons that it exists within. And here I'm thinking about some work on how nuclear family relationships, and especially monogamous romantic relationships, tend to draw people in and away from their communities. And so you see kind of the kind of evidence you see for this is that people see single folks are, I don't know, statistically more likely to do community volunteer work, for example, or to care for aging relatives and things like that. Whereas what I'm thinking about when I think about eudaimonic love, the daimon of a relationship, it being a good daimon, it's partly about whether it's a good daimon for others, not just internally within itself. Not just does it make the people in the relationship happy, but is that relationship a collaboration that then supports others around it? Okay, so that just to emphasize is the interconnectedness that I'm talking about when I move away from romantic conceptions to eudaimonic conceptions. And the other thing about it that I think is really important is making space for these so-called negative emotions. Love is really very often actually defined as a positive emotion in not just in philosophy, but in various parts of scientific literature on this too, especially in psychology. And like happiness, love is treated as being something that you feel and something that feels nice. And I think, in fact, some recent work in philosophy is really helping us to push back against that idea. So there have been folks working on this for a while, but one recent exemplar who's doing really good work on this is Maisha Cherry, who is she's working on anger primarily. And one of her theses about anger is that a loving relationship has to have room for anger, because as she put it to me one time, I can't love you and let you get away with stuff, right? If I love you and you're doing something wrong, my anger is my prompt to help you stop doing that and to correct the swerve. I also want to add to that eudaimonic love is, I hope, is going to make room for sad love that is not a tragic failure condition, but something more like the grayscale sadness of a life where you are just struggling. And I think of this sometimes on the analogy with parental love, where parents, if you interview new parents especially, and you ask them whether they're happy, they'll typically say no. But it doesn't mean their lives aren't meaningful. It doesn't mean they regret their decisions to have children. It just means that happiness is not the point of having that child, right? The love is not about being happy themselves. And similarly for eudaimonic love, what I want to say is it's just not about being happy yourself. It's much more about what you can do in all of those ways that I was describing. So another way that I've sometimes phrased it is that eudaimonic love, at least in my life, how I experience it, is not love that makes me happy, but it's love that makes me possible, and more possible than I would be without it. Okay, that is the end, and I hope I haven't gone on too long. I'm just concluding here with a little bit of one of my favorite poems by Edna St. Vincent Millay. She's talking about the fact that love can still be real love even if it finishes and isn't forever. This is from a poem called Passa Mortuus Est, and she just says, "After all, my erstwhile dear, my no longer cherished, need we say it was not love, now that love is perished?" And thanks for listening, and I'm very happy to take your questions.